The steady hum of hospital activity filled the halls as Dr. Bobby Thompson strode through the main corridor of St. James Medical Center. The bright fluorescent lights reflected off his crisp white coat, the badge on his chest reading, Dr. Bobby Thompson, Chief Surgeon. At 45, Bobby carried the weight of his title with a calm authority. His dark skin, close-cropped hair, and confident stride marked him as a man who had overcome countless challenges to reach the top of his field. To his colleagues, he was a respected leader, known for his sharp skills in the operating room and his unshakable composure in the face of pressure. Today, like most days, the hospital was bustling with patients and staff moving in all directions. Nurses guided patients to their rooms, doctors reviewed charts, and families huddled in waiting areas, their faces etched with concern. Bobby made his way to the surgical wing, ready for the long day ahead. It wasn't an unusual day in any way, at least not until the Richardson case landed on his desk. In the waiting room of the emergency ward, Karen Richardson sat with her elderly mother, Helen, who had fallen and suffered a severe hip fracture earlier that morning. Karen, a sharp-featured woman in her mid-50s, had a stern, almost dismissive air about her. She was used to things being done her way, and in her world, money and status solved most problems. Dressed in a designer suit with perfectly styled blonde hair, she was the type who believed her opinions held more weight than those of others. Her piercing blue eyes scanned the busy room with disapproval as she tapped impatiently on her phone. Her mother's condition was serious. The doctors had informed her that Helen needed immediate surgery to repair her hip. Karen was already on edge, worried about her mother's health, but what she hadn't anticipated was the source of her growing frustration. When Dr. Bobby Thompson introduced himself as the chief surgeon who would perform the procedure, Karen's face immediately hardened. "Hello, Mrs. Richardson," Bobby said, his voice calm and professional as he approached. "I'm Dr. Bobby Thompson, and I'll be performing your mother's surgery today. I've reviewed her x-rays, and it's clear we need to operate quickly to prevent any further complications." Karen glanced at Bobby, her gaze lingering on his face for just a moment longer than it should have. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, a hesitation. Bobby was used to it by now. Over the years, he had encountered it in various forms. Sometimes it was subtle, a pause before a handshake. Other times it was more overt, like the way Karen's lips pursed together, as though she were trying to swallow an unpleasant taste. "Dr. Thompson, is there someone else, someone more experienced who can do the surgery?" Karen asked, her tone thinly veiled with concern, though her question was anything but innocent. Bobby raised an eyebrow, though his expression remained neutral. "I assure you, Mrs. Richardson, I am more than qualified to handle your mother's surgery. I've been the chief surgeon here for several years, and I specialize in these types of procedures." Karen crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly as she scrutinized him. Well, my mother's condition is very delicate, and I want to make sure she's in the best hands. Are you certain there isn't someone else available?" Behind her, Helen groaned softly, her frail body shifting uncomfortably in the wheelchair. She hadn't said much since they arrived, too weak and in pain to engage in conversation. But Karen's insistence had nothing to do with her mother's comfort and everything to do with her own discomfort. Bobby maintained his calm demeanor, even as he felt the familiar sting of her words. He knew exactly what she was implying, and it wasn't the first time he'd faced this kind of scrutiny. But in this moment, his priority was Helen, not Karen's misplaced biases. "I can assure you, your mother is in excellent hands," Bobby replied, keeping his voice steady. "This is a routine surgery for someone with my experience. The sooner we operate, the better the outcome will be for her recovery." Karen opened her mouth to object again, but before she could speak, a nurse entered the room to update Bobby. "Dr. Thompson, the OR is ready," the nurse said. Bobby nodded and turned back to Karen. "If you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for surgery," Bobby said, his tone leaving no room for further argument. He gave Karen a polite nod before walking toward the operating room, leaving her standing there, fuming. As Bobby disappeared down the hall, Karen's frustration boiled over. She couldn't believe they expected her to trust this man, this black man with her mother's life. She had seen his title, heard his reassurances, but none of it mattered. She had her own ingrained ideas of what a doctor should look like, and Bobby didn't fit the image she had in mind. Karen reached for her phone and angrily dialed the hospital's main office. "Yes, I need to speak with the administrator," she demanded, her voice clipped. "There's a serious issue here, and I need it addressed immediately." Within minutes, Karen was escorted to the office of Sarah Green, the hospital's CEO. Sarah, a composed woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, listened as Karen laid out her grievances, each one dripping with barely concealed bias. "I'm just concerned about the level of care my mother will receive," Karen said, her voice tight. "I mean, Dr. Thompson, he just didn't inspire much confidence. Isn't there someone else more experienced who could handle this?" Sarah didn't flinch. She had dealt with complaints like this before, though they never ceased to surprise her. "Mrs. Richardson," Sarah began, her voice measured, "I can assure you, Dr. Thompson is one of the finest surgeons in this hospital. In fact, he's saved more lives here than anyone else on our staff." Karen shifted in her seat, clearly dissatisfied with that answer. "I'm sure he's very capable, but this is my mother we're talking about. I think it's only fair that we have a doctor we're comfortable with." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Karen's with a quiet intensity. "I understand your concerns, but let me be very clear. Dr. Thompson will be performing your mother's surgery. He is our chief surgeon for a reason, and we stand by his qualifications and abilities." Karen's face flushed, and for a moment she was speechless. She hadn't expected to be shut down so quickly, but Sarah's firm stance left no room for argument. With no other options, Karen left the office, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As she stormed out of the office, Karen pulled out her phone and typed furiously into a social media post, hoping to rally support against Bobby and the hospital's decision. Karen paced outside the hospital administrator's office, her fingers flying across her phone's screen as she posted a furious message about her terrifying experience. "I just found out the doctor performing surgery on my mother is someone I don't trust at all. I asked for someone else, but the hospital refused. Shouldn't I have a say in who operates on my own mother? Healthcare fail, incompetence, do better." Her words were sharp, aimed with precision. She knew exactly what she was doing. Within minutes, comments started pouring in, some echoing her frustrations, others laced with more venomous undertones. "Outrageous. You should demand a new doctor immediately. Can't believe they would force you to accept someone you don't trust. Sounds like a lawsuit waiting to happen." But then came a different kind of comment, one that Karen hadn't anticipated. "Isn't Dr. Bobby Thompson the chief surgeon? I've heard nothing but good things about him. Dr. Thompson saved my father's life last year. He's amazing. You might want to reconsider. He's one of the best in the country." Karen frowned, her anger flaring once more. She dismissed the positive remarks, focusing instead on the voices that fueled her outrage. In her mind, it wasn't just about her mother anymore. It was about proving that she had a right to demand better treatment, even if that meant bulldozing her way through what she didn't fully understand. Meanwhile, inside the operating room, Bobby and his team were preparing for the surgery. The sterile environment of the OR was a world of precision and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos Karen was attempting to create. Bobby had long since developed a mental filter for situations like this. Years of experience had taught him to focus on the task at hand, leaving the noise outside to settle itself. He knew about Karen's complaints, of course. Word had spread quickly through the hospital, as it often did when patients made a fuss. But Bobby didn't let it faze him. He had a job to do, and that job was to ensure Helen Richardson came out of this surgery with the best possible outcome. "Dr. Thompson, everything's ready," said his lead nurse, Susan, breaking his concentration as she handed him the patient's updated chart. "Vitals are stable, and anesthesia is standing by." Bobby glanced down at the chart, confirming the details one last time. "Good," he said. "Let's make this as smooth as possible." The team moved with practiced ease, each person playing their part in the delicate dance of surgery. Bobby's hands were steady, his mind sharp, as he guided his instruments with precision. Every stitch, every cut was deliberate, methodical, and controlled, There was no room for error. Not here, not ever. As the surgery progressed, Bobby found his rhythm. It was in these moments that he felt most at peace, despite the pressure that came with the job. Every surgery was a puzzle, and solving it gave him a sense of purpose that nothing else could. It was why he had fought so hard to get to this point, despite all the obstacles that had been thrown in his path. He was used to patients like Karen, people who took one look at him and questioned whether he belonged in a position of authority. He'd encountered it in med school, during his residency, and even after he had earned the title of chief surgeon. But the doubts of others didn't define him. His work did. And today, his work would prove once again why he deserved every accolade he had earned. Outside the operating room, Karen paced back and forth, her anxiety mounting with every passing minute. She had been in the hospital waiting room for over 2 hours now, and the uncertainty was gnawing at her. Despite her outward bravado, there was a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind that wondered if she had been too hasty, too quick to judge. Karen's mother, Helen, had been everything to her growing up. She had raised Karen on her own, working long hours to make sure her daughter had everything she needed. The thought of losing her now was too much for Karen to bear. She couldn't help but feel like she had to take control of the situation, but perhaps, in her desperation, she had lost sight of what really mattered. Just as Karen was starting to spiral into her thoughts, Sarah Green, the hospital administrator, appeared by her side. Sarah's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to Karen's agitated state. "Richardson, I wanted to check in with you personally," Sarah said, her voice steady and professional. "Dr. Thompson is currently performing the surgery, and I can assure you everything is going smoothly. Your mother is in very good hands." Karen turned to face Sarah, her expression a mixture of frustration and helplessness. "I just don't understand why I couldn't have had a say in who operates on her. This is my mother's life we're talking about." Sarah nodded, her gaze empathetic. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Richardson, and believe me, we always take our patients' wishes into account. But in this case, there truly is no better person for the job than Dr. Thompson. He's one of the most skilled surgeons in the country, and his experience is exactly what your mother needs right now." Karen let out a sharp breath, still not fully convinced but too tired to keep arguing. "I just hope you're right. I promise you, I wouldn't trust anyone else with my own family's care," Sarah said firmly. "I know you're anxious, but I want you to know that we're doing everything we can to ensure the best outcome for your mother." Karen didn't respond right away. She simply sat down in one of the chairs by the waiting room window, staring out at the gray sky. It felt like the whole world was closing in on her. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure she had control over what happened next, and that scared her more than anything. Back in the operating room, Bobby was nearing the end of the procedure. The surgery had gone as planned, and Helen's condition was stable. He carefully sutured the final incision and stepped back, letting out a quiet sigh of relief. "Great work, everyone," Bobby said, his voice steady but tired. "Let's get her into recovery." The team worked quickly to move Helen to the recovery unit, where she would be monitored closely for the next several hours. Bobby removed his gloves and mask, washing his hands at the sink as his mind began to shift back to the reality of Karen's complaints. He knew what awaited him outside that OR. He had been through this before. The skeptical family members, the complaints to the hospital board, the thinly veiled racism that hung in the air like a toxic cloud. But no matter how many times it happened, it never stopped stinging. As he dried his hands and stepped into the hallway, Bobby braced himself for what was to come. He wasn't looking forward to the conversation he would have to have with Karen, but for now, he focused on what mattered most. Helen had made it through the surgery, and she was going to be okay. Bobby stepped out of the OR, his white coat slightly rumpled, but his calm demeanor intact. His mind was still on the surgery, replaying every detail to ensure everything had gone exactly as planned. He had done this hundreds of times before, but every case carried its own weight. With Helen Richardson's surgery a success, there was a brief sense of satisfaction, until he remembered what awaited him. He sighed quietly as he made his way to the recovery room, mentally preparing for the inevitable conversation with Karen. He had dealt with patients like her before, people who assumed his skin color meant he wasn't as capable, despite the facts. But it never got easier. Every time, it felt like a personal battle, a reminder that he had to prove himself in ways his white colleagues didn't. As he approached the recovery room, he spotted Karen standing near the nurse's station, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wasn't scrolling on her phone anymore. Now her focus was entirely on the double doors leading to where her mother was being stabilized. Her expression was tense, a mixture of worry and irritation etched into the lines of her face. Bobby straightened his posture and approached her calmly. "Mrs. Richardson," he began, his voice even, "I wanted to let you know that the surgery was successful. Your mother is in recovery now, and she's stable." Karen's eyes flicked up to him, her jaw clenched. She didn't smile or show any relief. Instead, she narrowed her gaze, searching his face for something, some sign of weakness or incompetence she could latch onto. "She's okay?" Karen asked, her voice tight. "Yes," Bobby confirmed. "The procedure went smoothly. We repaired the fracture and she should make a full recovery. It's important to follow the rehabilitation plan we'll put in place, but I'm confident she'll regain full mobility over time." Karen stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Bobby could see the internal struggle playing out behind her eyes, her reluctance to accept that he had done his job and done it well. "That's good," she finally muttered, though her tone was far from grateful. She shifted awkwardly, as if she was about to say something more, but then closed her mouth, her lips pressed into a thin line. Bobby nodded, maintaining his professionalism despite the undercurrent of tension between them. "If you have any questions about her recovery, or if there's anything else you need to discuss, I'm happy to go over it with you." Karen glanced down at the floor, her expression hardening again. "Actually, there is something," she said, her voice low but with an edge. "I want to know why the hospital wouldn't listen to me when I asked for someone else to do the surgery." Bobby kept his face neutral, though inside he felt a pang of frustration. Here it was, the real issue. She couldn't just be relieved that her mother was okay. She had to hold on to this misplaced anger, this need to assert control over something she barely understood. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Richardson," Bobby said, his voice measured. "But as the chief surgeon, it's my responsibility to ensure that patients receive the best possible care. Your mother's surgery required my expertise, and I can assure you that I was the best person for the job." Karen's eyes flashed, her grip tightening on the strap of her designer handbag. "You think you know what's best for my mother just because you have a fancy title? I know what I saw when I met you. I saw someone who—" She stopped herself, catching the words before they could spill out. But Bobby knew what she had been about to say. "Someone who looks like you." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air between them, and Bobby felt the familiar weight settle on his shoulders. He had heard it all before, the subtle insinuations, the microaggressions disguised as concern, the way his qualifications were called into question simply because of the color of his skin. He kept his expression calm, though inside his patience was wearing thin. "Mrs. Richardson," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I understand that this has been a stressful time for you. Your mother's well-being is important to all of us, and that's why we made the decisions we did. If there was any doubt about my ability to perform this surgery, I wouldn't have been assigned to it. But I can assure you, your mother received the highest standard of care." Karen bristled, clearly not satisfied with his response. But before she could respond, the doors to the recovery room opened, and a nurse stepped out. "Mrs. Richardson, your mother is awake. You can see her now," the nurse said with a kind smile. Karen blinked, her attention immediately shifting to her mother. She hesitated for a moment, then without a word she turned and followed the nurse into the recovery room, leaving Bobby standing in the hallway. He exhaled slowly, feeling the tension ease from his shoulders as Karen disappeared. It was far from over. He knew that much. But for now, the most important thing was that Helen was awake and stable. Everything else could be dealt with later. As Bobby turned to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, and glanced at the screen, social media notifications. His brow furrowed as he opened one of the posts, only to find Karen's earlier rant at the top of his feed. "This hospital is a nightmare. They refused to listen to me when I asked for a different doctor for my mother. How can they force someone on us without any choice? Healthcare disaster unacceptable." Bobby sighed as he scrolled through the comments. A mix of outrage and support for Karen filled the thread, but interspersed were posts from people defending him. "Dr. Thompson saved my daughter's life. You're lucky he's the one doing the surgery. Dr. Bobby Thompson is the best surgeon at St. James. You should be grateful he's taking care of your mom." Still, it was exhausting. He didn't want to be the center of some social media firestorm. He just wanted to do his job, to help people. But people like Karen made it difficult, turning a life-saving surgery into something about control and entitlement. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and made his way to his office. He needed a moment to himself before dealing with the fallout. As much as he tried to stay focused on the work, it was moments like this that reminded him of the additional battles he had to fight, battles his white colleagues didn't have to face. Bobby sat down at his desk, running a hand over his face as he tried to push the frustration aside. He knew he couldn't let this get to him. There was too much at stake, too many lives depending on him to be at his best. He would face Karen again if he had to. But for now, he took a deep breath and let the satisfaction of a successful surgery carry him through the moment. Bobby spent the next few hours catching up on paperwork and reviewing patient charts, trying to stay focused on his work. He knew Karen's post would likely blow over. These things usually did. But the sting of it lingered. Every negative comment about him, every doubt, every sliver of bias that surfaced, chipped away at the thick skin he had built over the years. He wasn't naive. He understood that no matter how skilled he was, no matter how many lives he saved, people like Karen would always find a way to question his competence, to make him feel like he didn't belong, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. The quiet knock on his office door broke through his thoughts. He looked up to see Sarah Green, the hospital's CEO, standing in the doorway, her face drawn with concern. "Bobby, do you have a minute?" she asked, her voice low. He nodded, gesturing for her to come in. Sarah stepped inside and closed the door behind her, a signal that this conversation was about to be more serious than a routine check-in. Sarah sat down across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "I've been following the situation with Karen Richardson," she began. "It's starting to pick up traction online. Some of the comments are getting out of hand." Bobby sighed, rubbing his temple. "I figured as much. People love jumping to conclusions without knowing the full story." Sarah leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "I want you to know that the hospital is standing behind you 100%. We've already released a statement reaffirming your qualifications and emphasizing the success of the surgery, but you and I both know how quickly these things can spiral." Bobby nodded, his jaw tight. He appreciated Sarah's support, but it didn't change the fact that he was in the middle of a storm he didn't create. "It's frustrating," he admitted. "I did my job, and I did it well. Her mother's recovering, and that should be the end of it. But it's not." Sarah's expression softened. "I know it's not fair, Bobby. You've worked harder than anyone to get to where you are, and it's infuriating that people still question you based on something as superficial as skin color. But unfortunately, that's the world we live in. And it's people like Karen who remind us that the fight for equality is far from over." Bobby looked down at his desk, the weight of her words sinking in. He had heard these kinds of speeches before, from mentors, colleagues, even from Sarah herself, but it never made the reality any easier to swallow. "I'm just tired," he admitted quietly. "Tired of constantly having to prove myself. It's like no matter what I do, no matter how many lives I save, I'm always one misstep away from being judged by the color of my skin rather than the content of my character." Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "You're right. It's exhausting, and it's not fair. But you've handled this situation with grace. Bobby, you didn't let Karen's biases affect the way you treated her mother. You stayed professional as always." Bobby leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "I appreciate that, Sarah. But what do we do now? Karen's not going to let this go, and if this blows up anymore, it could affect the hospital. Sarah's face grew serious. We're monitoring the situation closely. If Karen continues to escalate, we may need to involve legal counsel. But for now, we'll continue to support you and address any concerns the public has head-on. This hospital is proud to have you as our chief surgeon, and I won't let anyone undermine that. There was a brief pause before Sarah added, "By the way, Helen is doing well in recovery. I spoke to the nurses earlier, and she's stable and awake. She'll likely be ready for discharge in a few days if everything continues to go smoothly." Bobby felt a wave of relief at the news. "That's good to hear. At least there's that." Sarah stood, giving him a reassuring smile. "You've done your part, Bobby. Now let us handle the rest." As she left the office, Bobby exhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair. He knew Sarah was doing everything she could to mitigate the situation, but it didn't change the fact that his reputation was under attack. Again. He had learned long ago that for a black man in a position of authority, a single complaint could be enough to unravel years of hard work. Later that afternoon, as Bobby made his rounds in the hospital, he noticed a group of nurses gathered around a smartphone in the break room, their faces tight with concern. He slowed his pace, curiosity tugging at him. As he approached, one of the nurses, Lydia, glanced up and immediately turned the phone toward him. "Dr. Thompson, have you seen this?" she asked, her voice low. Bobby took the phone from her and glanced at the screen. It was another post from Karen, this time more direct and personal. "I demanded a different doctor, but the hospital refused to listen. They forced my mother to undergo surgery, performed by someone completely unqualified. How many more families have been subjected to this kind of treatment? How can a hospital like St. James employ someone who isn't capable of handling delicate cases? #patient rights, #injustice. His heart sank as he scrolled through the comments. They were worse than before. People who didn't know him, didn't know his track record, were piling on, calling for his resignation, questioning the hospital's credibility. It was the same old story. People making snap judgments based on misinformation and assumptions, feeding off each other's anger without bothering to dig deeper. But what hit him hardest was the accusation of being unqualified. That was the word that stung the most, because it was rooted in the very biases that had shadowed him his entire career. No matter how much he proved himself, no matter how much he excelled, there was always someone ready to question whether he deserved to be where he was. Bobby handed the phone back to Lydia, his expression tight. "I appreciate you showing me," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. Lydia nodded, her face creased with worry. "This is ridiculous, Dr. Thompson. Everyone here knows how good you are." "None of this is fair." Bobby gave her a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks, Lydia, but it's not about fair, it's about perception, and sometimes that's harder to fight." He turned and walked away, his mind racing. This was bigger than just one patient's dissatisfaction. Karen's post had started a firestorm, and now it was spreading faster than he could control. The hospital had his back, but he couldn't help but wonder if that would be enough in the face of public scrutiny. As Bobby headed back to his office, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from an old colleague, Dr. David Patel, someone he hadn't spoken to in a while. "Hey Bobby, I just saw the mess online. I know you're probably getting a lot of noise, but if you need someone in your corner, I'm here. I've been through something similar, and I've got some advice on how to navigate it. Let me know if you want to talk." Bobby felt a flicker of gratitude at the message. It was comforting to know he wasn't alone in this. Still, it didn't change the fact that this fight wasn't just about one surgery. It was about every obstacle he'd faced as a black man in a predominantly white field. He typed out a quick response to David, thanking him for his support, and then put his phone away. For now, he needed to focus. Helen was stable, but his fight with Karen and the storm she had unleashed was just beginning. The days following Helen Richardson's surgery were quiet, at least within the hospital walls. Helen's recovery had gone smoothly, and the medical staff ensured she was receiving the best possible care. However, outside the sterile and controlled environment of St. James Medical Center, the storm Karen Richardson had stirred up continued to brew online. Bobby kept his head down, focusing on his patients, but the pressure was mounting. The hospital's PR team had issued a public statement backing him, but Karen's posts had already gone viral, attracting a mixed crowd, some sympathetic to her concerns, others fiercely defending Bobby. The debate had shifted beyond Helen's surgery, morphing into a larger conversation about race, healthcare, and privilege. It wasn't long before the media caught wind of the story. Several local news outlets had reached out to Bobby for comment, but he declined every request. He wasn't interested in becoming the center of a media frenzy, especially not for something so rooted in misunderstanding and bias. The last thing he wanted was to turn this into a public spectacle. Still, he knew it was only a matter of time before it reached a breaking point. By midweek, Helen was well enough to be discharged. Bobby made it a point to visit her one last time before she left, ensuring that all her questions about recovery were answered and that her rehabilitation plan was clear. As he walked toward her room, his thoughts drifted to Karen. He knew he'd likely see her again, and though he had been nothing but professional throughout the ordeal, there was an unsettled feeling gnawing at him. Would she finally acknowledge his skill, or would she continue to see him through the narrow lens of her prejudice? When Bobby entered the room, he found Helen sitting up in bed, a slight smile on her face. She looked more alert and energetic than she had in days, her frail frame propped up by soft pillows. Karen sat by her bedside, her arms folded across her chest as she scrolled through her phone. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Richardson," Bobby greeted them, flashing a polite smile. "How are you feeling today?" Helen looked up and gave a weak but genuine smile. "I'm feeling much better, thank you, Dr. Thompson. The nurses have taken great care of me." "That's good to hear," Bobby replied, glancing briefly at Karen. Her face remained impassive, her eyes barely lifting from her phone. He knew better than to expect any gratitude from her. "I wanted to go over your discharge instructions and your rehabilitation plan before you leave," Bobby continued, focusing his attention back on Helen. "The physical therapy team will follow up with you regularly to make sure your mobility improves, and it's important to stick to the plan for the best possible recovery. I'll be overseeing your progress, so if you have any concerns, you can always reach out to me directly." Helen nodded, her eyes warm with gratitude. "Thank you, Dr. Thompson. I truly appreciate everything you've done for me. I don't know what we would have done without you." Bobby felt a small sense of relief at her words, but it was tempered by Karen's silence. She hadn't said a word, but her presence was heavy in the room, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. After Bobby finished going over the instructions, Helen reached out and touched his hand gently. "You've been wonderful," she said, her voice soft. "I'm glad you were the one who took care of me." Bobby smiled at her, appreciating the gesture. "It's been my pleasure, Mrs. Richardson. I'm glad you're doing well." He turned to leave, but as he reached the door, Karen's voice cut through the quiet room. "Wait!" Bobby stopped and turned back, his expression unreadable as he faced Karen. She stood up, her phone clutched in one hand, the tension between them palpable. For a moment, she hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line as if she was wrestling with something inside herself. "I owe you an apology," Karen said finally, her voice low, "for everything." Bobby's eyes met hers, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, he saw something different in her expression, something that resembled humility, or at least a flicker of self-awareness. She glanced at her mother, then back at Bobby, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't trust you," she continued, her voice tightening, "not because of your qualifications, but because of other things. And I was wrong. You saved my mother's life, and I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment. I'm sorry for that." There was a beat of silence as Bobby absorbed her words. He had imagined this moment a dozen times over the past few days, but now that it was here, it didn't feel like a victory. It wasn't the kind of apology that erased the hurt or made everything right, but it was something, a start perhaps. "I appreciate the apology," Bobby said, his voice steady but guarded. "But this isn't just about me. It's about recognizing how these assumptions affect more than just one person. I'm glad your mother is doing well, but I hope you'll take some time to think about why you felt the way you did. It's not easy to confront those things, but it's necessary." Karen shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flickering with a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness. "I know," she muttered. "I will. I wanted to thank you, that's all." Bobby nodded, accepting the sentiment for what it was. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't undo the damage, but it was a step in the right direction. "I'm glad I could help your mother," he said simply. With that, Bobby left the room, the door closing softly behind him. As he walked down the hallway, he felt a strange sense of closure, though it wasn't the kind of neat ending he had hoped for. He knew that Karen's apology wouldn't fix the deeper issues that people like him faced every day. But it was a reminder that change, however small, was possible, even if it was just one person rethinking their assumptions. As Bobby returned to his office, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Sarah Green. "I've been monitoring the situation online. Things seem to be dying down, but I thought you should see this." Attached was a screenshot of Karen's latest social media post. "I owe St. James Medical Center and Dr. Bobby Thompson an apology. My mother received excellent care, and I let my personal biases get in the way of seeing that. We're lucky to have someone like Dr. Thompson at this hospital. I'm sorry for any harm my words may have caused." Bobby stared at the message for a moment, surprised. He hadn't expected Karen to publicly acknowledge her mistake, but there it was, in plain text for the world to see. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Lydia, the nurse who had shown him Karen's previous post, standing in the doorway with a tentative smile. "Just thought you'd like to know," she said, holding up her own phone. "Looks like you've got a few more fans now. People are rallying behind you." Bobby nodded, offering her a small smile in return. "Thanks, Lydia, I appreciate it." As she left, Bobby leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, slow breath. The storm had passed for now, but there would always be more battles to fight, more people like Karen to face. And Bobby knew that he would face them with the same strength and resolve that had carried him through every obstacle before. Because, in the end, he was more than just a surgeon. He was a survivor, a leader, and a man who refused to let the weight of others' doubts define him. The days following Karen's public apology brought a wave of support for Bobby, not only from the hospital staff, but also from people outside the walls of St. James. His social media feed was now filled with messages of gratitude from patients and colleagues, many of whom shared their own positive experiences with him as a surgeon and leader. The once volatile online discussion had shifted dramatically. Instead of questioning his competence, people were now celebrating his accomplishments, recognizing the obstacles he had overcome as a black man in a predominantly white field. But even as the public sentiment turned in his favor, Bobby remained grounded. He knew better than to let the praise go to his head. For every Karen Richardson, there were countless others who still held on to their prejudices, even if they didn't voice them as loudly. It wasn't lost on him that his work in breaking down those barriers was far from over. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Bobby found himself sitting in his office, reflecting on everything that had happened. The quiet of the hospital at night offered him a rare moment of peace, a chance to process the whirlwind of the past few days. The soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of voices in the hallways created a familiar, almost comforting backdrop to his thoughts. He thought about Karen's apology, not just the words, but what they represented. It was a small victory, yes, but it was also a reminder of the deeply ingrained biases that still existed, even in places like a hospital, where saving lives should transcend race or background. Bobby had spent his entire career proving himself, time and again, and while this was one more battle won, he knew it wouldn't be the last. A knock at the door broke his reverie. Bobby looked up to see Dr. David Patel, the colleague who had reached out to him during the height of the online backlash. David stepped inside, offering a warm smile as he closed the door behind him. "Bobby," David said, leaning against the edge of the desk, "I've been meaning to check in on you. I know things got pretty intense there for a while." Bobby smiled, grateful for David's presence. "Yeah, it was a bit of a roller coaster, but I think the worst of it is over now." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I saw Karen's apology. I have to say that's more than most people in her position would do. It doesn't erase what happened, but it's something. It is, Bobby agreed, but it also makes me think about how many people don't apologize, how many people just walk away, never realizing the damage their assumptions cause. David sighed, his face heavy with shared understanding. I've been there. I've seen it too. People who think they know you just by looking at you, who think they have the right to question your qualifications because you don't fit their idea of what a doctor should look like. He paused for a moment before adding, "It gets exhausting." "It does," Bobby replied, his voice low. "I just wish people like Karen could see that it's not just about one surgery or one moment of doubt. It's about the accumulation of all those moments over the course of a lifetime. That's what wears you down." David looked at him, his expression full of empathy. "But you've handled it with grace, Bobby. You didn't let her tear you down, and now people are seeing you for the leader you've always been. You're setting an example for others, whether you realize it or not." Bobby nodded, though the weight of David's words sat heavily on his shoulders. He had never set out to be a symbol or a spokesperson for change. He had just wanted to be a surgeon, to help people. But he knew now that his journey was about more than just healing bodies. It was about breaking down barriers, too. As David stood to leave, he placed a hand on Bobby's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, man. Keep doing what you're doing. You're making a difference, whether they want to admit it or not." "Thanks, David," Bobby said, his voice quiet but sincere. "That means a lot." After David left, Bobby sat alone in his office for a few more minutes, letting the quiet settle around him. He glanced out the window at the city lights twinkling in the distance, a reminder that life outside the hospital never really stopped, no matter what was happening within its walls. The following week, the hospital held a staff meeting, as they often did, to go over the latest updates and patient outcomes. But this time, there was an added sense of unity in the room. Bobby could feel it as soon as he walked in, an unspoken camaraderie among the staff, many of whom had been following the situation with Karen and the media. As he took his seat, Sarah Green stood at the front of the room, preparing to address the team. She smiled warmly at Bobby before turning her attention to the rest of the staff. "I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge something important," Sarah began, her voice calm but commanding. "As many of you are aware, we've recently dealt with some challenges involving one of our patients and the public perception of our hospital. While this has been a difficult time for some, I want to make it clear that St. James Medical Center stands by its values of excellence, integrity, and equality. And we stand by our doctors, especially Dr. Bobby Thompson." The room erupted into applause, the sound filling the space with an energy that surprised Bobby. He hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated such a show of support from his colleagues. But as he looked around the room, seeing the faces of the people he worked alongside every day, he realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about all of them. It was about the culture they were building together, a culture of inclusivity, respect, and trust. Sarah smiled as the applause died down. "Bobby has been an exemplary leader in this hospital for years, and I know I speak for all of us when I say we're grateful for his dedication, his skill, and his compassion. St. James is better because of people like him, and we'll continue to support him in every way we can." Bobby felt a lump form in his throat as the applause started up again. It wasn't often that he allowed himself to feel the impact of his work in such a personal way, but in that moment, he felt the warmth of his colleagues' support wash over him like a wave. After the meeting, as people filtered out of the room, Bobby lingered near the back, exchanging quiet words of thanks with those who approached him. He shook hands, smiled, and nodded at their words of encouragement. But inside, he was already thinking about the future, about the next patient he would treat, the next challenge he would face, the next barrier he would have to break down. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone in that fight. His colleagues were with him, his patients were with him, and he knew that no matter how many more Karens he encountered along the way, he would face them with the same strength, grace, and resolve that had carried him this far. Because at the end of the day, Bobby Thompson wasn't just a black surgeon trying to prove himself in a world that often doubted him. He was a healer, a leader, and a man who had earned his place, not just through his skills, but through the quiet strength that came from knowing who he truly was. And that, more than anything else, was what mattered most.